A flight to remember. The afternoon sun blazed through the large windows of the bustling JFK International Airport. Passengers streamed through the terminals, each wrapped in their own world of business, family reunions, or leisurely vacations. Among them was Simone Carter, a seasoned flight attendant with nearly a decade of experience. Today, however, her usual calm demeanor was fractured. Simone's morning had been a chaotic blur. She overslept, spilled coffee on her crisp uniform, and fought through the city's relentless traffic to barely make it to her shift. By the time she stepped onto Flight 217, she was a bundle of nerves. The route from New York to Los Angeles was a common one for her, but something about today felt off, a nagging unease she couldn't shake. The first-class cabin was already filling up with passengers, each carrying the unmistakable air of wealth and entitlement. Simone forced a smile as she greeted them, her eyes scanning the list for their assigned seats. That's when she noticed a name that gave her pause. Richard Taylor. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't immediately place it. Richard Taylor entered the cabin shortly after. He was tall, well-dressed, and exuded a quiet confidence that drew the attention of everyone around him. Simone observed him discreetly as he settled into his seat near the window. There was a certain gravity to his presence, a commanding aura that made people instinctively stand a little straighter. It wasn't until another crew member whispered, "That's the billionaire tech mogul," that the pieces clicked into place. Richard Taylor was not just any passenger. He was a man whose name was often splashed across headlines, a self-made billionaire known for his cutting-edge innovations and philanthropic ventures. But those who worked closely with him whispered about his ruthless demeanor and unyielding standards. Simone had no interest in catering to egos today, billionaire or not. As the flight prepared for takeoff, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Simone moved efficiently through her pre-flight duties, but her earlier frustrations were simmering just beneath the surface. She avoided eye contact with Richard, focusing instead on helping other passengers stow their luggage and settle in. Still, she could feel his gaze follow her occasionally, cool and calculating. The flight was uneventful at first, the hum of the engines blending with the murmur of conversations and the clinking of glasses. Simone worked briskly, trying to shake off the day's irritations, but when Richard pressed the call button for the third time within an hour, her patience began to wear thin. "Miss," Richard said as Simone approached his seat. His tone was calm but carried an undercurrent of impatience. "This drink is lukewarm. I'd appreciate it if you could bring me a fresh one." Simone clenched her jaw. "Of course, sir," she replied with forced politeness, taking the glass from him and walking briskly to the galley. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some sympathetic, others amused. Returning with a fresh drink, Simone set it down on Richard's tray with a little more force than necessary. "Here you go, Mr. Taylor," she said, her voice clipped. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing, simply nodding in acknowledgement. The situation escalated during meal service. Richard requested a specific dish that wasn't on the menu, and when Simone politely informed him of this, his response was sharp. "I would expect an airline of this caliber to accommodate such a simple request," he said, his tone cutting. Simone felt her control slipping. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have a set menu for this flight. If you'd like, I can offer you one of our premium options." "I'm not interested in excuses," Richard replied coolly. "I suggest you find a solution." It was the final straw. Simone's voice trembled with suppressed anger as she said, "With all due respect, sir, we're not running a private dining service here. If you'd prefer that level of customization, perhaps you should consider flying on your private jet." A stunned silence fell over the cabin. Simone immediately regretted her words, but the damage was done. Richard's expression darkened, and his gaze locked onto hers, unyielding. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice dangerously calm. "Are you suggesting I don't belong here?" Simone's heart pounded in her chest. "No, sir, that's not what I meant," she stammered, suddenly aware of how precarious her position was. "I just meant—" Before she could finish, Richard stood abruptly. His towering presence seemed to fill the cabin, and the passengers around them watched with bated breath. He leaned in slightly, his voice low but firm. "You've made a grave mistake today. I don't tolerate disrespect." Simone's mind raced, a mix of indignation and fear battling for control. Her hands clenched at her sides as she tried to maintain her composure. "I apologize if I offended you, sir," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard straightened, his expression unreadable. "We'll see if your apology is enough," he said, then returned to his seat, leaving Simone standing there, her face flushed with humiliation. As the flight continued, Simone's initial anger gave way to unease. She had crossed a line, and she knew it. But what she didn't know was just how far Richard Taylor was willing to go to make her regret it. The warning signs. The hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin as Simone busied herself with post-meal service. The clinking of glasses and the low murmurs of passengers barely registered in her mind. Her focus was on maintaining a calm exterior, even as her insides churned with anxiety. She stole a glance at Richard Taylor, seated in 3A. His demeanor was unnervingly calm, but his piercing gaze remained fixed on her whenever she was within his line of sight. Simone had dealt with difficult passengers before, demanding business people, fussy children, even celebrities who treated the crew like servants. But something about Richard Taylor felt different. His quiet, controlled manner was more unsettling than any shouting match she'd endured. He wasn't the type to make a scene. He was the type to settle things later, in ways that would sting much harder. As she made her way down the aisle, a colleague, Mia, caught her arm. "Simone," Mia whispered urgently, pulling her aside near the galley. "What's going on with that guy in 3A? He hasn't stopped watching you." Simone sighed, leaning against the counter. "It's nothing. Just a misunderstanding. He's upset because I couldn't cater to his every whim." Mia frowned. "Simone, do you know who he is?" "Yes, Mia, I know who he is," Simone replied, her voice edged with frustration. "He's Richard Taylor, the billionaire tech mogul. Big deal. He can't expect the world to bow down to him." Mia shook her head. "It is a big deal. People like him don't let things go. You need to be careful." Simone rolled her eyes, brushing off Mia's concern, but deep down, her colleague's words unsettled her. She couldn't shake the feeling that Richard's measured silence was more dangerous than an immediate outburst. 5 minutes later, back in her seat in the galley, Simone tried to collect herself. The flight was more than halfway through, and she just needed to hold it together until they landed in Los Angeles. But then, she noticed Richard standing in the aisle, speaking quietly into his phone. His voice was low, but his words carried a weight that made Simone's stomach drop. "Yes, I want the full dossier," he said, his tone clipped and efficient. "Background checks, employment history, personal details. Everything. Make it a priority." Simone froze, the tray in her hands slipping slightly. Her mind raced. Was he talking about her? It couldn't be. Surely, no one would go to such lengths over a minor disagreement on a flight. When Richard ended the call and returned to his seat, Simone tried to act natural as she passed him. But as she moved closer, he looked up, his eyes locking onto hers with a cold, unreadable expression. "You might want to prepare yourself," he said softly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Actions have consequences, Miss Carter." Simone's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. Instead, she turned and hurried back to the galley, her hands trembling. The other crew members noticed her unease but said nothing. The unspoken rule among flight attendants was clear: deal with problems quietly, avoid escalating situations at all costs. The descent. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Simone couldn't focus on the usual landing preparations. Her mind kept replaying Richard's words and the ominous phone call she had overheard. Mia approached her again, her expression serious. "Simone, you need to report this." "To who?" Simone asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "The airline. Do you think they'll take my side against someone like him?" Mia hesitated, then sighed. "Maybe not, but you can't just ignore this. He's not like the usual passengers. He has the power to ruin lives." Simone bit her lip, the weight of Mia's warning sinking in. But what could she do? The incident had already spiraled out of control, and she doubted any attempt to de-escalate would make a difference now. As the plane touched down, Simone felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that the flight was over, but dread for what awaited her on the ground. She avoided Richard's gaze as passengers disembarked, focusing instead on tidying up the cabin. But just as she thought she could breathe easy, she noticed him lingering near the exit. "Miss Carter," Richard said as she approached, his tone polite but firm. "I trust you'll reflect on today's events. I'm sure we'll cross paths again." Simone's heart sank as she nodded stiffly. "Have a good day, Mr. Taylor," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The aftermath. By the time Simone reached her small apartment in Queens, she was physically and emotionally drained. She collapsed onto her couch, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that Richard's parting words were more than a casual remark. They were a promise. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was an email from her supervisor. Simone's stomach dropped as she opened it. Subject: Incident report required. Dear Simone, we've received a complaint from a passenger regarding today's flight. Please submit a detailed account of the incident within 24 hours. Simone's hands trembled as she read the message. She knew what this meant. Complaints from first-class passengers were taken seriously, especially when they came from someone as influential as Richard Taylor. As she began typing her response, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Mia. "Simone, I think you should know. People are talking. Taylor has connections everywhere. Be careful." Simone stared at the message, her heart pounding. She had always prided herself on handling difficult situations with professionalism, but this time, she had miscalculated. She had underestimated Richard Taylor, and now she was caught in his crosshairs. The ripples begin. The following morning, Simone woke to the incessant buzzing of her phone. Her head throbbed from a sleepless night, but the notifications wouldn't stop. She reached for the phone, squinting at the screen, and her heart sank. Her inbox was flooded with emails from unknown senders, some with subject lines that made her stomach churn. Unprofessional behavior on Flight 217. Think twice before you act, Miss Carter. You've messed with the wrong person. Scrolling through her social media accounts only made it worse. A video from the flight had surfaced online, grainy but clear enough to show her sharp exchange with Richard Taylor. The video had gone viral, and the comments were a mix of scorn, mockery, and outrage. She really thought she could talk to Richard Taylor like that. This is why some people shouldn't work in customer service. Entitlement at its finest. Hope she learns her lesson. Simone's breath quickened as she read the vitriol. Her private accounts were being tagged relentlessly, and someone had even shared a photo of her in her flight attendant uniform. It was clear now. Richard Taylor wasn't just powerful, he was vindictive, and this was his first strike. A call from the airline. Simone's phone rang, the name of her supervisor, Linda Brooks, flashing on the screen. With trembling hands, she answered. "Hello. Simone." Linda's voice was unusually curt. "We need to talk. Have you seen the video circulating online?" Simone's throat tightened. I have. "This is serious," Linda continued. "We've been contacted by Mr. Taylor's legal team. They've filed a formal complaint against you, citing unprofessional behavior and verbal misconduct." Simone's chest felt like it was caving in. "Linda, I didn't do anything wrong. He was rude to me the entire flight. Linda cut her off. "That may be, but this isn't just any passenger. This is Richard Taylor. He's one of the airline's most influential clients. Corporate wants a full investigation. Until then, you're suspended without pay." The words hit Simone like a freight train. Suspended. Linda, please. I can explain. Simone. Linda said firmly, I suggest you take this time to think about your actions. We'll be in touch. The line went dead. Simone stared at her phone, the weight of the situation settling over her. She wasn't just fighting for her reputation now. She was fighting for her livelihood. The second wave. By noon, Simone's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Calls from unknown numbers, messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years, and even a few reporters seeking a statement. The escalation was dizzying. How had this gotten so far so fast? Her doorbell rang, startling her. She peeked through the peephole and saw a man in a suit holding a clipboard. He looked official, his posture stiff and professional. Miss Carter. He called out, I'm with the Taylor Legal Group. We'd like to speak with you regarding the incident on Flight 217. Simone's blood ran cold. She stepped back, heart pounding. How had they found her address? Was this even legal? She didn't answer, waiting silently until the man left a business card at her door and walked away. She picked up the card once he was gone, her hands trembling. On the back, a handwritten note read, This isn't over. Call us to resolve this matter amicably. Amicably. Simone scoffed, tossing the card onto the counter. She knew what that meant. An apology, a public statement, maybe even groveling for Richard Taylor's forgiveness. The thought made her stomach churn. Turning the tables. Simone spent the next few hours researching Richard Taylor, hoping to find some way to fight back. Article after article painted him as a genius entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and a champion of innovation. But there were darker whispers too. Accounts of employees silenced after filing lawsuits, competitors crushed under the weight of his influence, and rivals mysteriously disappearing from the industry. She began compiling notes, bookmarking links, and saving screenshots. If Richard wanted a fight, she wasn't going to back down without a plan. But the more she read, the more she realized just how insurmountable the odds were. Richard wasn't just a billionaire. He was a fortress, protected by layers of lawyers, PR teams, and loyalists who would defend his reputation at all costs. Simone's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Mia. Mia. Simone, I heard about the suspension. Are you okay? Call me if you need anything. Simone hesitated before replying. She didn't want to drag Mia into this, but the isolation was starting to weigh on her. She called. Simone. Mia answered on the first ring. I've been so worried. This whole thing is insane. It's worse than I thought, Simone admitted, her voice shaky. He has people tracking me, calling me, even showing up at my door. Richard Taylor doesn't play games, Maya said grimly. But you can't just roll over. You need help. Legal help. With what money, Mia? Simone asked, frustration bubbling to the surface. I'm suspended without pay, and I don't have the resources to fight someone like him. There was a pause on the line before Mia spoke again. I might know someone. A journalist. She's taken down people like Taylor before. If anyone can expose his tactics, it's her. Simone's heart skipped. You think she'd help me? I'll reach out, Mia promised. But you need to be ready. Going public with this won't be easy. Once you start, there's no going back. The journalist. The following day, Simone met with Mia's contact, a sharp-witted investigative journalist named Evelyn Carter, no relation. Evelyn was known for her fearless exposes on corruption and abuse of power, and she wasted no time getting to the point. Simone. Evelyn began, flipping through her notebook. You're up against a man who has built an empire on fear and control. He's not just targeting you because of what happened on that flight. He's sending a message to you, to his peers, to anyone who might think of crossing him. Simone nodded, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. I don't know where to start. He's already ruined my career. My name is all over the internet. What can I even do? Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes sharp. We fight back. Not with money, not with lawyers. With the truth. If there's dirt on Richard Taylor, we'll find it. And when we do, we'll make sure the world sees him for who he really is. Simone felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. What do you need from me? Everything, Evelyn replied. Emails, texts, any documentation from your employer, and most importantly, your story. We're going to turn the spotlight onto him, but you need to be prepared for the backlash. Simone took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had spent her entire life playing it safe, avoiding conflict, and keeping her head down. But now, with everything she had worked for stripped away, she realized she had nothing left to lose. I'll do it, she said finally, her voice steady. Let's take him down. The battle lines are drawn. Simone sat across from Evelyn in the dimly lit coffee shop, her fingers wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of tea. Evelyn's laptop was open, the screen filled with meticulously organized folders labeled with names like Taylor Incorporated lawsuits and NDAs, alleged misconduct. The journalist's reputation for being relentless was clearly well earned. Evelyn leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning Simone's face. Let's start from the beginning, she said. Not just what happened on the flight, but everything leading up to it. I need context, your state of mind, his behavior, every word exchanged. Simone hesitated. It's not just about the flight, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It's about the power he wields. It's terrifying. Even before he made that phone call, it felt like he already knew he could ruin me. Evelyn nodded, her fingers flying across the keyboard. That's what men like him thrive on. Fear. They don't need to shout or threaten. Their reputation does the work for them. Simone glanced around the coffee shop, half expecting one of Richard's people to materialize out of nowhere. But how do you fight someone who is untouchable? Evelyn smiled faintly, her eyes glinting with determination. No one's untouchable. Everyone has skeletons. The trick is finding the ones they've tried the hardest to bury. The web of influence. Over the next few days, Evelyn worked tirelessly to uncover the threads of Richard Taylor's empire. Her research revealed a man who wasn't just a genius innovator, but a master manipulator. His rise to power had been meteoric, but it had also left a trail of ruined lives in its wake. Simone spent hours recounting every detail she could remember about the flight, her interactions with Richard, and the aftermath. Evelyn probed her with questions that felt invasive at times, but Simone understood their importance. Did anyone on the crew witness the slap? Evelyn asked during one session. Simone frowned, thinking back. Mia was nearby, but she didn't see it happen. Most of the passengers were preoccupied with their own business. But I remember one man in 4B. He had his phone out the whole time. He might have recorded something. Evelyn's fingers paused mid-typing. A video would be gold. Do you remember what he looked like? Mid-40s, business suit, glasses, Simone said. He was on a conference call when the plane boarded. Evelyn jotted down notes. I'll track him down. If he has footage, it could be the leverage we need. Richard Taylor's countermove. Meanwhile, Richard Taylor wasn't idle. In his sprawling office overlooking downtown Los Angeles, he sat in a sleek leather chair, his assistant, Jessica, standing nearby. Status update, Richard said, scrolling through his tablet. Jessica adjusted her glasses. The social media backlash against Simone Carter is holding steady. The video from the flight has been shared over 10 million times. Public sentiment is overwhelmingly in your favor. Richard nodded, but his expression remained impassive. And the airline? They've suspended her without pay and initiated an internal review. However, Jessica hesitated. Richard's gaze sharpened. However, there's chatter that she's seeking outside help. A journalist named Evelyn Carter, no relation, has been asking questions. She's digging into your past. Richard set the tablet down, his jaw tightening. Evelyn Carter, he repeated. She's the one who exposed Jameson Oil last year. Jessica nodded. Yes, sir. She's relentless. If she's involved, This could escalate. Richard's lips curved into a cold smile. Let her dig. She won't find anything I haven't already buried. Jessica shifted uncomfortably. Still, it might be wise to neutralize her efforts before they gain traction. Richard's smile faded. I'll handle it. Make sure the airline understands their loyalty to me is non-negotiable. Yes, sir, Jessica replied, already typing notes into her phone. Evelyn's breakthrough. A week into her investigation, Evelyn finally caught a break. Her relentless efforts to track down the man in 4B had paid off. His name was Mark Donovan, a mid-level executive in a tech company. After some persuasive emails, Evelyn managed to arrange a meeting. Simone joined her at the small cafe where they met with Mark. He looked nervous, glancing around as if expecting to be followed. Thank you for meeting with us, Evelyn began, her tone reassuring. We're not here to make trouble for you. We just need to know if you have any footage from the flight. Mark hesitated, then pulled out his phone. I didn't record the whole thing, but I got bits and pieces. I wasn't trying to make a scene. Well, when Richard Taylor's involved, you know it's going to be something big. He handed the phone to Evelyn, who played the video. The grainy footage showed the heated exchange between Simone and Richard, including the slap. More importantly, it captured Richard's calm but chilling response. You've made a grave mistake, he said in the video, his tone icy. Evelyn's eyes lit up. This is perfect. It shows his calculated demeanor. He wasn't humiliated. He was planning his revenge. Simone, watching over Evelyn's shoulder, felt her chest tighten. Seeing the moment play out on screen brought all her emotions flooding back. But this time, she wasn't just scared. She was angry. The article. With the video as a centerpiece, Evelyn began crafting her exposé. The article detailed Richard Taylor's history of silencing dissent, the pattern of lawsuits and settlements that had quietly disappeared, and his use of influence to crush anyone who stood in his way. Simone's story was the heart of the piece, a flight attendant who had dared to stand up to a powerful man and was now paying the price. Evelyn included Mark's video, redacting his name for privacy, and pointed out the troubling implications of Richard's behavior. When the article was published, it exploded across social media. The headline alone was enough to draw attention. The Untouchable Titan: How Richard Taylor Weaponizes Power Against Everyday People. Within hours, the story was trending worldwide. While some dismissed it as sensationalism, others began sharing their own experiences with Richard or similar figures in positions of unchecked authority. The fallout. Richard Taylor sat in his office, the article pulled up on his screen. His expression was unreadable, but his clenched jaw betrayed his irritation. Jessica stood nearby, her face pale. Damage control, Richard said finally. Issue a statement denying all allegations. Remind the media that libel suits are costly. Jessica nodded. Already in progress. But, sir, public opinion is shifting. The article has gained significant traction. Richard's gaze darkened. Let them talk. This will pass. But even as he said the words, he felt the first cracks in his armor. For the first time, his power was being questioned, and Simone Carter was no longer the meek flight attendant he had dismissed. She was becoming something far more dangerous, a symbol. The Empire Strikes Back. The article's impact was swift and seismic. Social media buzzed with debates, news outlets picked up the story, and prominent figures began weighing in. While some sided with Richard Taylor, others questioned the morality of a man who wielded his influence to punish someone for a single moment of perceived disrespect. Simone, however, found little solace in the growing support. Her phone continued to ring incessantly. Reporters seeking interviews, strangers offering unsolicited advice, and even threatening messages from anonymous sources. Each call reminded her of the power she was up against. At Evelyn's urging, Simone agreed to stay at a secure location for a few days. Evelyn had seen this kind of backlash before and knew it was only a matter of time before Richard Taylor made his next move. Richard's retaliation. In his penthouse office, Richard Taylor stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling cityscape. Behind him, Jessica updated him on the fallout from the article. "The story is gaining traction, sir," Jessica said, her voice steady but tinged with unease. "We've issued a formal denial and threatened legal action against the publication, but Evelyn Carter isn't backing down." Richard turned, his expression cold. "What about the airline?" "They're cooperating fully. They've reinforced their suspension of Simone Carter and are prepared to terminate her employment pending the investigation." Richard nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Good. Keep the pressure on. I want her to feel the weight of her choices." Jessica hesitated before continuing. "Sir, with all due respect, the public sentiment isn't entirely in your favor. People are questioning your motives. Some are even calling this a misuse of power." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Let them. Public opinion is as fleeting as a passing storm. They'll forget once the next scandal surfaces." Jessica bit her lip but said nothing. She had seen Richard crush opponents before, but this time felt different. The backlash was growing louder, and the cracks in his invincible image were becoming harder to ignore. Simone finds her voice. Hiding away in Evelyn's friend's guest house, Simone paced the small living room, her mind racing. She felt trapped, a pawn in a game far bigger than herself. But as she scrolled through the comments on Evelyn's article, something shifted. For every cruel remark, there were voices of support, people sharing their own stories of standing up to powerful figures, others calling for accountability for billionaires who abused their influence. Slowly, Simone began to realize that she wasn't alone. Evelyn found her staring at her phone, tears streaming down her face. "Simone, what's wrong?" Simone looked up, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "I've been so focused on what I've lost that I forgot what I'm fighting for. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been silenced or crushed by people like Richard Taylor." Evelyn smiled. "Then let's make your voice heard." The interview. A week later, Simone sat in front of a camera in Evelyn's home studio. The journalist had arranged for a live interview with a major independent news outlet known for exposing corruption. Simone was nervous, but Evelyn reassured her. "Be honest," Evelyn said, adjusting the microphone clipped to Simone's blouse. "Tell your story. Let people see the human being behind the headlines." As the camera rolled, Simone took a deep breath. The interviewer began with a soft question, asking her to recount what happened on Flight 217. Simone spoke carefully at first, but as the interview progressed, her words grew more passionate. "I made a mistake," she admitted. "I shouldn't have slapped him. But what's happened since then, it's about more than a slap. It's about power and control. Richard Taylor has used his wealth and influence to destroy my life because I dared to stand up to him. This isn't just about me. It's about the kind of world we want to live in. Do we let people like him dictate our futures, or do we fight back?" The interview ended with a thunderous wave of support online. People began sharing Simone's words, calling for accountability and urging others to speak out against abuses of power. Richard's crumbling shield. In his office, Richard watched the interview with a stony expression. Jessica stood nearby, nervously checking her phone. "She's gaining sympathy," Jessica said quietly. "The narrative is shifting. People are calling her brave." Richard remained silent, his mind calculating his next move. He had built his empire on control, on ensuring that no one dared to question his authority. But now, for the first time, he felt the weight of a battle he might not win. "Prepare a response," he said finally, his voice sharp. "A public statement. Make it clear that I have no intention of backing down." Jessica nodded but couldn't hide the doubt in her eyes. As she left the room, Richard turned back to the screen, watching Simone's tearful but determined face. For the first time in years, he felt something foreign creeping into his chest. Unease. The domino effect. The morning after her interview, Simone woke to a flood of notifications. Her social media, which had been a battleground of criticism and support, was now overwhelmingly positive. Messages of encouragement poured in from strangers around the world, many of whom shared their own experiences with power imbalances and injustice. Her words had struck a chord, igniting a broader conversation about wealth, privilege, and accountability. Evelyn arrived at the guest house mid-morning, her laptop tucked under one arm and a triumphant smile on her face. "Simone, you've done it," she said, setting her laptop on the dining table and pulling up several news sites. "Your story is everywhere." Simone leaned over to read the headlines. "Flight attendant speaks out. A fight against power and intimidation. The billionaire and the slap. How a single flight sparked a global conversation." Simone Carter, a voice for the silenced. "It's surreal," Simone murmured, shaking her head. "But it's not over. Richard Taylor isn't going to let this go." Evelyn's expression turned serious. "You're right. And that's why we need to be ready for his next move." Richard Taylor's counterattack. In his sprawling mansion, Richard Taylor sat in his study, the glow of his computer screen illuminating his face. The public sentiment was shifting faster than he had anticipated. His calculated image of power and control was now being questioned, dissected, and, worst of all, criticized. He couldn't allow this to spiral further. Jessica entered, carrying a folder. "Sir, we've compiled a response. A formal apology to the public and a statement offering to settle the matter with Simone Carter." Richard looked up sharply. "Apology? Settlement? You think groveling is the answer?" Jessica hesitated. "It's not groveling, sir. It's damage control. The longer this drags on, the more people will turn against you." Richard's jaw tightened. "I built this empire by refusing to yield. If we apologize now, we're admitting fault. That's not an option." Jessica sighed, setting the folder on his desk. "The board is getting nervous. Investors are asking questions. If this escalates, it could impact your other ventures." Richard stood, his movements deliberate. "Then we shift the focus. Dig deeper into Simone Carter's past. If she wants to play the hero, we'll remind the world that she's far from perfect." Jessica's expression darkened. "Sir, attacking her personally might backfire." "Then do it carefully," Richard snapped. "Find something, anything, that undermines her credibility. Make her doubt herself. That's how we win." A past unearthed. A day later, Evelyn burst into the guest house, her face flushed with urgency. "Simone, we have a problem." Simone looked up from the kitchen table, where she'd been responding to supportive messages. "What is it?" Evelyn handed her a tablet. On the screen was a breaking news story. "Flight attendant's troubled past comes to light." The article detailed a series of minor infractions from Simone's early career: lateness, a few disciplinary write-ups, and an exaggerated account of an argument with a former colleague. "This is a smear campaign," Evelyn said, her voice tight with anger. "None of this is relevant, and some of it's outright false." Simone felt her cheeks flush with humiliation. "I can't believe this. They're twisting everything to make me look bad." Evelyn placed a reassuring hand on Simone's shoulder. "This is Richard Taylor's playbook. He wants to discredit you so people stop listening. But we're not going to let that happen." Rallying support. Evelyn wasted no time. She reached out to prominent advocates and organizations who had been following Simone's story, rallying them to her defense. Within hours, a wave of support countered the smear campaign. Public figures took to social media to condemn the attack. Simone Carter's past is irrelevant. This is a transparent attempt to silence her. We stand with Simone. Women speaking out against powerful men shouldn't have their lives dissected. Enough is enough. Richard Taylor's tactics are a textbook example of why accountability matters. Simone, though overwhelmed, found strength in the growing movement. She appeared in a second interview, this time addressing the smear campaign directly. "They're trying to silence me by digging up things that have no bearing on what happened," she said. "But this isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's ever been bullied into silence. We deserve better." The public response was swift and emphatic. #WestStandWithSimone began trending on social media, and donations poured in to support her legal fund. Richard's empire shakes. As the backlash intensified, cracks began to appear in Richard Taylor's fortress. Investors grew wary of the negative press, questioning his judgment. Employees within his company started leaking stories of mistreatment, emboldened by Simone's courage. Jessica returned to Richard's office with a grim expression. "We have another problem," she said, placing a stack of papers on his desk. "A group of former employees is planning to file a class action lawsuit. Workplace harassment, wage theft, you name it." Richard scanned the documents, his face betraying no emotion. "How credible is this?" "Credible enough to get media attention," Jessica replied. "They're saying Simone's story gave them the courage to come forward." Richard clenched his fists. For the first time, he felt the weight of a battle slipping out of his control. The turning point. 1 week later, Simone stood on the steps of a courthouse, surrounded by reporters and supporters. Flanked by Evelyn and her newly hired lawyer, she addressed the crowd. "This isn't about revenge," Simone said, her voice steady. "It's about standing up for what's right. Richard Taylor thought he could destroy me, but he underestimated the power of truth and community. I'm here to show him, and anyone else like him, that no one is above accountability." Inside the courthouse, a judge granted Simone a temporary restraining order against Richard, citing his attempts to intimidate and discredit her. The ruling was a symbolic victory, but it sent a clear message. The tide was turning. Richard's reckoning. Back in his mansion, Richard watched the news coverage with a mixture of disbelief and fury. His empire, built on unshakable control, was now under siege. Jessica entered the room, her expression tense. "Sir, the board has called an emergency meeting. They're concerned about the lawsuits and the ongoing PR crisis." Richard's grip tightened on his glass of scotch. "Let them be concerned. I'm not stepping down." Jessica hesitated. "They might not give you a choice." As she left, Richard stared out the window, the weight of his decisions pressing heavily on him. For the first time in his life, he felt something unfamiliar, the possibility of defeat. The fall of an empire. The tension in the air was palpable as Simone prepared to step onto the stage of a packed auditorium. The event, titled "Voices Against Power," a call for accountability, had been organized by activists and advocates who had rallied around her story. It was more than a speaking engagement. It was a defining moment. As she stood backstage, Evelyn joined her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got this," Evelyn said. "You're not just telling your story anymore. You're speaking for everyone who's ever been silenced." Simone nodded, taking a deep breath. She adjusted the microphone clipped to her blazer and stepped onto the stage, greeted by thunderous applause. The crowd of journalists, supporters, and curious onlookers filled the massive hall, their energy electric. As the noise subsided, Simone began. 2 months ago, I was just a flight attendant. I worked long hours, faced difficult passengers, and loved my job despite the challenges. But one moment, one mistake, changed everything." The audience hung on her every word as Simone recounted the events that had brought her to this point. She spoke of the slap, the relentless campaign to discredit her, and the overwhelming support that had lifted her when she felt like giving up. "What Richard Taylor tried to do wasn't just about silencing me," Simone said, her voice firm. "It was about sending a message to anyone who dared to challenge him. But he underestimated the power of truth, of community, and of standing up for what's right." The crowd erupted into applause, and Simone felt a surge of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been crushed under the weight of unchecked power. The class action lawsuit. While Simone was rallying support publicly, Evelyn had been working behind the scenes with a team of lawyers representing former employees of Taylor Industries. The class action lawsuit against Richard Taylor had grown to include over 100 plaintiffs, each with harrowing stories of workplace abuse, intimidation, and discrimination. The lawsuit gained national attention, with major news outlets covering the testimonies of former employees who described a toxic work culture designed to silence dissent and reward blind loyalty. The parallels between their stories and Simone's experience were impossible to ignore, further eroding Richard's public image. One particularly damning testimony came from a former executive who had been part of Richard's inner circle. He didn't just want success, the executive said during a televised interview. He wanted control. Absolute, unquestioning control. The class action lawsuit became a rallying point for labor rights advocates and corporate accountability movements. Suddenly, Richard Taylor wasn't just facing public criticism. He was facing a legal battle that could dismantle his empire. Richard's last stand. In his private boardroom, Richard Taylor sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by the board of directors of Taylor Industries. The mood was grim. His once loyal allies now exchanged nervous glances, their confidence in their leader shaken. "This is a coordinated attack," Richard said, his voice cold and measured. "Simone Carter, Evelyn Carter, these employees, they're all being used to tear us down." One board member, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes, spoke up. "Richard, this isn't just about you anymore. The lawsuits, the protests, the boycotts, they're affecting our bottom line. Investors are pulling out. We have to consider the future of the company." Richard's jaw tightened. "The future of this company is me. Without my leadership, everything we've built will collapse." Another board member cleared his throat. "Respectfully, Richard, it's already collapsing. The board has voted to remove you as CEO." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Richard's face remained impassive, but his hands clenched into fists under the table. "This is my company," he said quietly. "You can't just push me out." The woman who had spoken earlier leaned forward. "You built this company, yes, but it's bigger than you now. If we don't distance ourselves from you, there won't be a company left to save." For the first time, Richard Taylor felt the full weight of his defeat. His empire was crumbling, not because of external forces, but because the people he had relied on were no longer willing to stand by him. The verdict. The courtroom was packed as the judge delivered the verdict in the class action lawsuit. Simone sat with Evelyn and the other plaintiffs, her heart pounding. The months of legal battles, public scrutiny, and sleepless nights had all led to this moment. The court finds Taylor Industries liable for multiple counts of workplace harassment, wage theft, and discrimination, the judge declared. The plaintiffs are awarded $200 million in damages, to be distributed among the affected parties. The room erupted into cheers, and Simone felt tears streaming down her face. It wasn't just a victory, it was a reckoning. Richard Taylor had finally been held accountable for his actions. As the crowd celebrated, Simone turned to Evelyn. "It's over," she whispered. Evelyn smiled. "No, Simone. It's just the beginning." The aftermath. Richard Taylor retreated from public life, his name synonymous with corporate greed and abuse of power. Taylor Industries, under new leadership, implemented sweeping reforms to rebuild its reputation and regain the trust of its employees. Simone, now a prominent advocate for workplace rights, used her platform to continue the fight for accountability and justice. She partnered with labor unions, spoke at conferences, and worked with lawmakers to push for stronger protections for workers. Despite the challenges she had faced, Simone emerged stronger, more determined, and more focused than ever. Her story wasn't just about a flight attendant who stood up to a billionaire. It was about the power of resilience, the importance of truth, and the strength of a community united against injustice. A new chapter. Months later, Simone returned to the skies, not as a flight attendant, but as a guest speaker for an airline's corporate training program. She stood before a room full of executives and flight crew, sharing her story and the lessons she had learned. "The most important thing I've learned," she said, "is that no matter how powerful someone seems, they're not invincible. When we stand together, when we speak out, we can bring about change." It's not easy, and it's not quick, but it's worth it. As the room erupted into applause, Simone felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. Her journey had been harrowing, but it had also been transformative. She wasn't the same woman who had boarded Flight 217 all those months ago, and for that, she was grateful. The final reckoning. The weeks following the courtroom verdict were a whirlwind of change. Richard Taylor, once a titan of industry, was now a pariah. News outlets dissected his downfall, from the court-ordered settlement to his removal as CEO. His once loyal allies distanced themselves, and the name Richard Taylor became shorthand for unchecked greed and power. Simone watched the coverage with a mix of emotions. While justice had been served, she couldn't ignore the lingering exhaustion from the battle. Evelyn had told her it was normal. Standing up to someone like Richard Taylor was never without a cost. The redemption tour. Simone's story had inspired countless others. She was invited to speak at conferences, university panels, and corporate events. Each engagement brought new opportunities to advocate for change. She became a symbol of resilience and courage, someone who had faced unimaginable odds and emerged stronger. But she also knew that she couldn't live in the spotlight forever. After one particularly long day of interviews, she confided in Evelyn. "I'm proud of what we've accomplished," Simone said, her voice soft. "But I'm ready to move on. I want to build something new, something that's about hope, not just fighting back." Evelyn smiled. "You've earned that, Simone. But don't forget, you've created a legacy. Even if you step away, the change you've inspired will keep growing." Richard's exile. Meanwhile, Richard Taylor retreated to his estate in the countryside, a shadow of his former self. The lawsuits and public outcry had drained his wealth and tarnished his reputation beyond repair. He had become a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most powerful could be brought low by their actions. Alone in his massive, empty mansion, Richard reflected on the choices that had led him there. He had built his empire on control, on the belief that he was untouchable. But in his quest for dominance, he had underestimated the strength of those who dared to stand against him. For the first time in years, Richard felt something unfamiliar: regret. But the world had moved on, and there was no path back to the life he once knew. A new horizon. 1 year after the events of Flight 217, Simone stood on the balcony of her new apartment, overlooking the city. The sun was setting, casting the skyline in hues of gold and crimson. Her life had changed in ways she could never have imagined, and while the journey had been painful, it had also been transformative. She was no longer a flight attendant, but the founder of a nonprofit organization dedicated to workplace equity and accountability. The organization, aptly named Elevate, had already helped hundreds of employees navigate difficult situations and fight against systemic injustices. Simone picked up her phone and scrolled through messages from her team. One message caught her attention. It was from Evelyn. "Just saw the latest numbers. Elevate is making waves. Proud of you." Simone smiled, typing a quick reply. "Couldn't have done it without you." As she set her phone down, she thought about the person she had been before that fateful flight. She had been strong but unsure of her voice, willing to endure mistreatment to avoid confrontation. Now she was unrecognizable even to herself. Closing the chapter. That evening, Simone attended a quiet dinner with friends, including Mia and Evelyn. They toasted to the victories they had achieved and the challenges they had overcome. To Simone, Evelyn said, raising her glass, "For showing us all that even the smallest voice can shake the tallest towers." Simone laughed, clinking her glass with the others. "To all of us," she replied, "for proving that together, we can make the impossible possible." The final word. As Simone walked home that night, the city lights twinkling around her, she felt a sense of peace. The battle with Richard Taylor had tested her in ways she never thought possible, but it had also revealed her strength and purpose. Life would never be the same, but she wouldn't want it to be. She had found her voice, her courage, and her calling. And as she looked up at the stars, she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning.